Good evening, everyone. I am Deborah Barros with Lisbon Elsner Engineers and Architects here in New York. And on behalf of the co-chairs and the Historic Building Committee, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Before we start, I would just like to remind you that the committee meetings happen on the third Monday of every month, the next one being April 22nd, and it's a hybrid meeting as well. So, tonight's program sheds a spotlight on the importance of materials conservation as a storytelling tool and as a bridge between tangible practice and intangible values. The subject of study is the Tenement Museum, one of the most cherished and significant cultural institutions in New York. But what makes it so special in the hearts and in the imaginary of New Yorkers and visitors alike? By opening a door into the past, this lecture will help us answer this question and understand how wall covering conservation and plaster conservation has contributed towards the representation and interpretation of the lives of over 7,000 people who inhabited the tenement structures. A pioneer in giving voice to the countless immigrants who make New York the city that we love, the Tenement Museum and the team of experts who supported all the preservation efforts have successfully broadened our understanding of conservation science, adaptive reuse, preservation philosophy, among other disciplines. Guiding us through the work performed in the magical spaces of the museum and all those time capsules that we love, we have today Stephanie Hoagland, a principal and senior architectural conservator with Jablonski Building Conservation. She's been working there since 2003. Mrs. Hoagland has worked on a variety of projects across the US and in Canada, including finishes investigations, conditions assessment, and hands-on conservation treatments. She's been working on various aspects of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum since early 2004. She is a recognized professional with the Association for Preservation Technology, APT, and a fellow and co-chair and chair of the Architectural Specialty Group for AIC, a past chair. We are thrilled to have Stephanie Hoagland with us tonight to highlight how the conservation and preservation of historic buildings can do what it's meant to do: service communities in the present, become a vehicle to the celebration of communities from the past, and provide responsible stewardship to protect and provide a future for numerous legacies. Please help me welcome Stephanie Hoagland.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me in the back? All right, perfect. When you think of the terms house museum, these are the types of spaces that you imagine. Whether it be a stately mansion decorated in rich fabrics and filled with art and fine furniture, or a simple and primitive home of the common man, you expect spaces that are safe, sound, clean, and fully furnished. But what if this is your house museum? A former tenement building that had been abandoned for decades before being converted into a museum. A building which endured over 50 years of water infiltration, uncontrolled fluctuations in temperature and humidity, and general neglect. A place that when found was covered in a thick layer of dirt and rooms filled with debris. With peeling paint and curled, torn, and peeling wallpaper over crumbling and failing plaster. What if you then decided to stabilize these spaces and work to keep the rooms exactly as you had found them? The room and apartments in the Lower East Side Tenement Museum have a powerful emotional impact on the visitor. But when a building only housed 7,000 inhabitants over the course of 72 years, how do you deal with the impacts of 225,000 visitors annually? The Tenement Museum is one of the most popular house museums in America, which essentially translates to 450,000 feet tracking in dirt and climbing the stairs, 450,000 hands touching the walls, 2.25 million fingers aching to pick at loose painted wallpaper, 225,000 mouths breathing hot air, and 50,000 school kids wanting to get just a little bit closer to the museum's exhibits every year. And it's a balancing act to keep visitors safe and comfortable while ensuring that the building remains sound and in good condition, and it can be a real challenge. And how many people here have been to the Tenement Museum? All right, oh man, that is a lot. Okay, I really like familiar, the Tenement Museum was founded in 1988 with the mission of interpreting a shared history that had long been ignored, that of urban, immigrant, and working class people. The museum's exhibit spaces are located in 2 different buildings. The original museum at 97 Orchard tells the stories of immigrants between 1863 and 1935. And their second building at 103 Orchard focuses on immigrants who arrived after World War II. Between 1863, when 97 Orchard was constructed, and 2011, when the last tenants of 103 Orchard were rehoused, together the 2 buildings served as home to approximately 15,000 people from over 20 different countries. And since 103 was never left fully vacant, I will be focusing on the challenges of the original museum at 97 Orchard for this presentation. Until recently, the Lower East Side had been home to the majority of immigrants who came to New York City. By the 1860s and 70s, hundreds of tenements, buildings constructed specifically to house large numbers of families in the same building, had been built as homes for these immigrants. Many of these tenements were multi-story buildings constructed on 25 by 100-foot lots. They generally contained 4 apartments per floor, each consisting of 3 rooms, a parlor, kitchen, and a small bedroom as shown on the floor plan to the right. As you can see in the historic photo at the top and the modern museum photograph on the bottom, the apartments of 97 Orchard are reflective of the general tenement layout. At the time of the building's construction, it was a 5-story brick tenement that housed 22 apartments and a basement saloon. Although intended for middle-class families, the building had no indoor toilets or running water. Light was supplied by candles and heat from a coal stove. But as newer buildings were constructed with more modern amenities, the middle-class families moved out and were replaced by working-class families and more recent immigrants. Again, with the historic photo at the top and the museum photo on the bottom, you can see that so many of these tenement spaces were just repeated ad infinitum throughout New York City. Like many tenements, modifications were made to 97 Orchard to comply with the city's developing housing laws. Passage of the first Tenement House Act in 1867 saw the installation of fire escapes for each unit. After the second Tenement House Act of 1879, each room of each apartment had to have windows to increase air and light. And this necessitated the cutting of new openings into interior walls to admit light and air into the kitchens and bedrooms, which were often dank and dark. The Tenement House Act of 1901 led to major changes, including the introduction of indoor toilets, 2 per floor, gas lighting, and increased ventilation through the addition of a full-height air shaft. And these additions, highlighted in red on the floor plan, were made to the southern half of the building and reduced the size of the already small bedrooms for half of the apartments. But these alterations were expensive, and before a 1935 law could be passed, which would have required each apartment to have a private bath, the building owner evicted the tenants and sealed off the upper floors, leaving only the storefront units open and generating rental income. The upper floors remained unoccupied until 1988, when the museum purchased the building. As a result, these apartments became a time capsule of immigrant life in America, and the museum is unique in its restoration and interpretation of the building and its occupants and its treatments of the ruined apartments in a state of arrested decay. The museum classifies their apartments into 2 different categories, and the first is restored. These apartments are those that have been restored or reconstructed to a specific time period in the building's history and are used as interpretive spaces. These apartments tell the stories of actual tenants of 97 Orchard using information gathered through historic research, census data, and family histories. Restoration treatments have included new plasterwork and sheetrock, skim coat repairs, new wallpaper, and painted finishes. And the second is preserved. These apartments have been stabilized in their as-found condition. Although these apartments exhibit cracked and detached plaster, exposed lab, peeling paint, and stained and sagging wallpaper, these rooms retain a level of authenticity that the recreated apartments simply don't have. For many visitors, these rooms are their favorite parts of the museum, and they provide a direct connection to the past. People lived in these spaces, walked these floors, and touched these walls. And for anyone who thinks that no one would ever live in a place with using plaster, torn wallpaper, or peeling paint, there are numerous photographs, many taken by the New York City Housing Authority, showing families living in just such conditions, which is one of the reasons why I think these preserved apartments make such a powerful impact for the visitor. While the materials in these apartments are in poor condition, they're an integral part of the museum. In addition to retaining the authenticity of the apartments, these rooms also help to tell the story of the inhabitants, including changes in aesthetic tastes. Changes in aesthetic taste over time. In one apartment, wallpaper conservator Reba Fishman-Snyder found over 22 layers of wallpaper applied one over the other, often with 7 to 10 layers of paint below the paper in the parlors. The walls of the kitchens and the bedrooms exhibit an average of 38 layers of paint, and a window reveal performed in the parlor of apartment 6, seen at the center, found painted decoration on the ceiling, which was completely unexpected. And many people think that because this was a tenement house, decorative and faux finishes would not be found. The faux wood grain is found throughout the museum, and here you can see a little bit of it poking through under multiple layers of paint. And it may be just that additional decorative schemes have not yet been discovered. In addition, these rooms also show the evolution of early 20th century repairs, including many areas of slab-dash finishes, which are not unusual in low-income housing. For example, the repair on the left is simply a piece of cardboard nailed in place to hide the missing plaster. JBC began working with the museum in about 1998. Now, this type of museum was something that had never really been done before. Sure, there's been entire buildings that were kept in ruins, but you then didn't normally invite people in to come and walk through them. Since the interior of the museum serves as a palpable connection to the past and provides an interpretive framework for the museum, stabilization of the materials is essential. In about 2002, the museum received a grant from the Getty to have JBC create an interior conservation plan. The goal of his plan was to develop treatments to stabilize and arrest the ongoing deterioration of the historic fabric, including linoleum, wallpaper, paint, plaster, and both the walls and ceilings. JBC began developing and testing means and methods for the conservation and stabilization of these materials without making them look new. And this often required us to think outside of our usual conservation toolbox. These treatments allow for the retention of the site's historic character, minimizes the loss of extant historic fabric, respects the contribution of all periods of the site's historic significance, helps to provide safe public access to the historic resource, and allows the museum to integrate historic preservation into their interpretive program. Now, this work didn't happen all at once. What you see in these images is the evolution of the museum over time. Working from left to right, the museum starts with just the main floor open and all the upper floors remain boarded up. Then the upper floors were slowly stabilized over the years and opened to visitors, as the museum was able to raise the funds for stabilization and interpretation of additional apartments. Now, this building was never designed to have hundreds of people traipsing through each day, and this kind of wear and tear really takes a toll. But when a building starts out as a ruin, how do you tell when it's getting worse? And we found that the best way for us is by monitoring the apartments. We do periodic reassessments, which looks at the walls, floors, and ceiling of each room of every apartment. It also includes measuring any bulging and dropped plaster. I do want you to note the shape of the walls in these drawings, that they are not rectangular is not a mistake. The architect originally gave us elevations with everything at a nice 90-degree angle, and we actually had to have them come back out and remeasure everything to create these accurate parallelograms you see here. The building has settled greatly over time, which has been an ongoing issue. And the building is like a living, breathing artifact that is continuously moving, which makes monitoring these apartments so important. The collection manager walks the building at the start of each day to look for any obvious signs of damage. But more importantly, the museum has done an excellent job of training their housekeeping staff to notify the museum if they see anything out of the ordinary. An increase in paint on the floor or plaster dust can be an early indication that something bad is about to happen. And by the time the collection manager walks the halls, the housekeeping staff has already been vacuuming since 6 a.m., so any of those little telltale signs would have already been swept up and removed. In addition to the daily walkthrough, the collection manager also does focused conservation monthly monitoring. It's typically scheduled so that each floor gets a thorough inspection every 6 months. And this is where our assessments and photographic documentation come into place. This information is used as a baseline. And at this point, between 2004 and 2019, we have done 3 full assessments. The last assessment in 2019 was part of a larger planning study. JBC, working with Lee Saltzman Architects, Stillman Engineering, and a team of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection consultants, looked at the building as a whole and made interdisciplinary recommendations to assist in the long-term planning. Working with input from the museum, the document provided current understanding of the conditions and provided options and prioritized recommendations to address the current and long-term issues and concerns. The goal of the work is to ensure the continued structural stability of the building and address other issues such as environmental controls, and anyone who's visited the museum in the summer knows just how sweltering it really gets inside these apartments. Although it was delayed a bit by COVID, the recommendations have been implemented, and the museum is currently finishing up a year-long $7 million major capital project. The comprehensive renovation included reinforced and protected original features, replaced the wood stair supports with steel, replaced the roof, replaced the windows to be more thermally efficient, and installed an HVAC system that delivers passive air through the 1905 air shafts and between the apartments. And here you can see the newly opened Moore apartment on the 5th floor with a detail of that venting system on the right. Our work during this past year has been an extension of the work that we've been doing to preserve the paint, plaster, and wallpaper in the preserved apartments. And tonight I want to go through some of the innovative ways that we've been conserving these materials and some of the changes we've made to our treatments over time. So let's start with the wallpaper. As a design element highly subject to changes in taste and style and fairly easy to remove and replace, wallpapers are one of the most vulnerable elements of a building, and surviving examples of historic papers can be rare. Google the term wallpaper conservation and most of the results will discuss the preservation of the opulent high-end papers found in the homes of the wealthy. But as preservation expands to include more vernacular structures, conservators are being asked to preserve interiors that have been finished in inexpensive, mass-produced wallpapers, which have often been overlooked by the conservation community. Now, one of the goals of that conservation isn't to make it look like the occupant just stepped out of the room for a minute, but to try to retain that sense that you're walking into a space that has been abandoned for the last 50 years. Wallpaper, originally made of cotton red, had historically been too expensive for the majority of Americans to afford until the mid-19th century. But with the introduction of machinery to make and print continuous rolls of paper, prices began to drop. However, it was the introduction of wood pulp, the paper-making process, which drove prices down far enough to become popular even amongst the poorest Americans. With prices starting at 4.5 cents per roll in 1898, an entire apartment could be papered for less than $1. Even the most inexpensive papers were printed in the most popular styles. An 1884 edition of Carpentry and Building stated, quote, "It's quite remarkable how quickly the supply for cheap and truly artistic papers has responded to the demand." That wallpaper was a popular interior finish for the working poor can be seen in the majority of the apartments at the museum, where there's a wide array of patterns, including Asian-inspired designs, abstracts, florals, brocades, and stripes. Borders, like the example on the bottom, are found in both floral and geometric patterns. Unlike higher-end wallpaper, which was generally applied over a liner, the wallpapers at the museum were originally applied either over multiple layers of paint or over plaster or wallboard repairs. And when you do find a liner, it's often just a newspaper, like you see here on the right, but more often than not, the wallpapers were just applied one layer right over the other. And the wallpapers in these apartments are not relegated to just the walls. They can also be found on the plaster ceilings in the parlors and the kitchen of many of the apartments. These papers may have been applied as decoration or more likely to hide cracks and repairs as the building aged. Many of the papers in the apartments are in poor condition. They're stained, torn, and sagging. Additionally, these apartments also exhibit conditions to the substrate which greatly affects the historic paper, including exposed lath, peeling paint, and cracked and bulging and detached plaster, which we're going to be discussing later. Materials testing performed on the papers found them to be pigmented craft-baked craft-based papers with starch and glue paste adhesives. So in addition to the damage caused by fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity, exposure to ultraviolet light, and failures of the substrate, these papers are also affected by the oxidation of the acidic wood pulp paper, which causes them to darken, become brittle, and lose strength over time. Over the years, conservation treatments have been performed in selected areas as funds became available. And this year, we've been restoring multiple apartments with wallpapers. The goal of these treatments has been to stabilize the paper while retaining the ruinous appearance of the apartment. Now, one of the easiest and least expensive treatments for the papers is simply cleaning. Many of the papers are torn and folded over or have become detached and are rippled on the surface of the wall. Each ledge of the paper is coated in a thick layer of dust. Paper that remains well adhered to the wall but is rippled is gently vacuumed using a HEPA vac with a soft brush attachment. And paper that has become detached is supported from the back, and then it's dusted with a soft bristle mop head brush, as you can see here. While the step seems simple, it's really crucial, especially if we're going to be using steam to flatten or uncurl these papers, because without cleaning, that dirt and dust just turns to mud. In terms of putting wallpaper back on the wall, most wallpaper conservators use adhesives. In 2004, we tested multiple types of adhesives, and the two best were a 20% solution of paraloid B72 in acetone and Jade R, which are both synthetic adhesives. But when we went to use them on a larger scale, we found that these dry, porous wood pulp papers are really absorbent and easily stained. And while the adhesives were not much of a concern on the heavier weight papers, it was most noticeable on the thin craft paper-based wallpapers, which are often the most recently applied, especially at the ceilings. The Jade R on these papers always stained the surface. And while our initial testing found that a 20% solution of B72 and acetone didn't stain the paper, our more recent testing shown here, using applications of 15, 25, and 50% solutions to the back of the paper, found that we needed closer to a 50% solution of B72 in acetone to reattach these papers without staining the surface. Unfortunately, above 25%, the adhesive tends to get thick and cummy with long tendrils of adhesive that would stretch from the container to the brush, and which makes it really difficult to be tidy. Additionally, any B72 that ends up on the surface of the paper makes it dark and shiny. In an effort to avoid the creation of additional stains caused by the adhesives on some papers, we developed a system of buttons or pins which are used to reattach the loose paper. The pins are installed with small stainless steel brads and gently hammered into the plaster. We use clear acrylic pins, 1/16 of an inch thick, in a variety of shapes and sizes. Rectangular pins are generally used along long tears, large discs for joining multiple tears, and small discs like this for small adhesion areas. If the buttons are carefully placed along the edge or along a tear, it's possible to re-adhere the paper without puncturing it. Once installed, the clear buttons don't block the pattern of the paper and are often difficult to discern once you step back from the wall. I know the lighting in here isn't great. Can you guys see where they are? There's multiple, so there you go. The pinning also has its drawbacks. Pinning at an edge in an effort to not puncture the paper is great if all of the edges are aligned, but the edge of the top paper is often at the center of the layer below. The brads also require a stable substrate to be inserted into. Here you can see the multiple holes that have been punctured into the paper, while the pins keep popping out because there's so many layers of wallpaper and no finished coat of plaster behind for the brad to secure it into. And the rectangular pin at the far right is also loose, and while it was installed vertically, it is rotated on the brad to a horizontal position. Also, much of the plaster in the museum is precarious, and there's nothing like hammering ever so gently yet still hearing all of that plaster crumble and just fall behind the paper to the bottom of the wall. But this is an inexpensive, low-tech repair, and we've been able to train the museum staff to install these pins to prevent the paper from continuing to tear from its own weight until we can return to perform proper treatments. One of the most recent materials we've been using for paper conservation is phenori or triphenori. Phenori is a Japanese glue mixture extracted from seaweed. It has been used in Japan for over 300 years as an adhesive, a consolidant, and a cleaning agent. As advertised, it doesn't leave tide lines, dries to a matte finish, and is non-toxic. As Fenori is a mild adhesive, we add a 4% solution of sturgeon glue to increase the strength of the adhesion. The application of Fenori is a multi-step process which involves a gentle cleaning and consolidating any exposed distemper paints. It's applied to the back of the paper, and then a second coat is applied over Japanese tissue paper, and then a wallpaper steamroller is rolled across it to flatten and remove any air bubbles. After the wallpaper is secured, the tissue is carefully removed, taking care not to disrupt the bond between the wallpaper and the plaster substrate. Brittle curled edges of the paper that cannot be flattened are also consolidated and strengthened using an airbrush application, and some detached pieces are left in the hanging position by creating a hinge with a strip of Japanese tissue paper secured at the back to provide additional support. In addition to preserving historic fabric, this method of treatment also retains that ruined look of the wallpaper by leaving strips hanging from the ceiling and puckered from the wall. Like most of the previous treatments, there were unexpected drawbacks to the Fenori glue mixture. And remember, as advertised, Fenori is not supposed to create tie lines or staining as it dries, but unacceptable staining was being noted in areas where it was applied. That speaks for itself. Testing was performed using both a brush and air application method, and these tests found that both methods discolored the paper and reduced the sheen of the silver ink. Swab tests were performed, and while the ink came off on the untreated areas, the swab from the treated area came away clean, which meant the product was doing what it was supposed to do, which is consolidating the paper. In an effort to prove that the Fenori mixture did leave tie lines, we also tested it on an old newspaper from 1935, and sure enough, it left no marks or staining. So there's just some elements in this historic wallpaper, whether it's the paper, glue, or the printing ink, which just reacts negatively. The mixture and the staining is inevitable. The Fenori treatment is the first step in the stabilization of plaster ceilings, which we're going to discuss later. But just quickly, it requires the use of a liquid consolidant, which ends up creating dark stains as it seeps through the cracks during application. The tie lines and darker staining of the consolidant required a discussion between JBC and the museum regarding an acceptable final appearance. And this is again where that balancing act from the title comes in. Together was decided that it was more important to retain the historic fabric and the plasters and the paper, which are already heavily stained from heavy water infiltration. They're just a little bit more stained, but they're no longer in danger of falling. Recently, JBC has been lucky enough to have added a paper conservator to our team who is here with us this evening, and she's been a great help and opened us up to additional methods of treatment, including things like using different types of application methods or adhesives on those walls that are not stable enough to use a pin, using Japanese tissue paper to line and strengthen large sections of fallen paper, and toning our tissue to allow it to blend in better when we create the hinges for paper for heating use. Now, I presented our work at the museum at some conservation conferences, and the means and methods that we use leave some paper conservators who work in really high-end museums a little bit flabbergasted. But we have to use all of the tools in our conservation toolbox because each space is so different. And what works best on one paper might not be the best for the paper in an adjoining room. And we're just trying to retain as much of this historic fabric as possible. And in order to preserve the wallpaper, we also have to preserve the plaster behind. And it's not just about retaining the finishes, but with plaster, there's also a real safety concern. We've been very lucky so far in that there have been very few areas of large plaster failure. The most recent one was in one of the interpretive apartments, see here on the left, where a section of the ceiling collapsed. Thank goodness it happened overnight, and so no visitors were hurt. But again, here's that balancing act of retaining damaged historic fabric while ensuring that the space is safe for visitors. One of the challenges with the plaster walls and ceilings at this museum is that some of the apartment walls were moved when the building was still occupied. Some walls are just sitting directly on the floor with no support from below. Other walls were only superficially joined with the perpendicular walls, which left them vulnerable to movement. The ceiling, which had just come down on the last slide, that wall to the left had been moved, so there's just a thin section of plaster in the former location of the wall. But the wall in the apartment above is still in its original location, with nothing to support from below, so it's just buried on that ceiling, and that was the location of failure. And on the right, you can see a large crack in the bedroom of apartment 9, where the walls have separated over time. Much of the plaster in the museum is in poor condition. Found condition includes missing plaster, both that which was missing when the museum opened and areas that have failed since. Missing ceiling plaster is often surrounded by drop plaster, where the keys behind have broken and there is nothing holding the ceiling to the lab. In the image on the right, you can even see a plaster washer, which was installed as a preventative measure when the ceiling was intact, which just missed the lab, therefore it offers no protection whatsoever. Missing plaster is also found on the walls, which presents its own unique set of challenges. The bulge on this wall in the parlor measures approximately 3 inches at its widest point. Luckily, the multiple layers of wallpaper appear to have held it in place, and this is a condition that's found in multiple rooms of multiple apartments. Well, the missing and bulging plaster involves the detachment of both the scratch and the ground coats. There are many areas where just the finish coat is not well adhered to the layer below. These images at left and center show how extensive this condition is, and it's gotten worse over the years. The rough surface texture of the brown coat is supposed to give the finish coat something to grip to, but in the museum, it is just curling up and falling off. There are also areas of previous repair where the skin coats of plaster were applied over failing painted finishes, such as the example on the right, and both of these conditions have led to large areas where the painted finishes are being lost. Like the wallpaper, we're having to make tough choices regarding how to preserve the plaster in these historic spaces. And also, like the wallpaper, we've had to take it apartment by apartment, room by room, and wall by wall. But while we're really working to preserve all of the wallpaper for the museum, for the plaster, we use 3 different classifications for our treatment: control, conserve, and condemn. For years, JBC's work at the museum was primarily being on call to make emergency repairs in order to save the day. If the cleaning ladies found a pile of plaster fragments on the floor, or one of the docents saw part of the ceiling that didn't look as bad as before, the museum would send us a call and set up that bat signal, and we would find it. Since we have multiple years of assessments, we would start by taking a look at past images and compare those with new images as we push them over. If it looked the same, we'd say, you know what, it's okay, just keep an eye on it. But if it looked worse, then we would clear our schedule and rush down to the museum to perform emergency treatments to stabilize the plaster. With control, we're really just trying to limit the damage, and control repairs are usually those that are done as a localized emergency repair. And here's one such example. Museum staff noticed that a crack in the ceiling appeared to have gotten larger. We looked at our previous photos and saw that yes, it had gotten bigger, and so I scheduled a time to come down to install some plaster washers. Getting to a ceiling when it's only dropped slightly like this is really the best scenario. The keys at the lab, again, are broken from behind, but the space between the lab and the top side of the plaster hasn't yet had a chance to fill with debris. So we're able to pull that ceiling back up tight with the lab. Even with a small crack, using a flashlight, we can generally figure out where the lab is, and so we can place our washers so that we're ensuring that the washers are actually catching into the wood. Once we install the washers, we'll paint them so that they're less noticeable, as you can see at the right. Here's a bigger example where the plaster failed and there was the possibility of losing additional material. These can be more difficult in that if the plaster has been displaced for a number of years, that void fills with debris and it prevents the plaster from being able to make contact with the lab. We use a long, big tool to pull out as much of the debris as possible, but we're not always able to remove all of it from below. The nice part about installing washers when the plaster has failed is that we can see the condition of the lab and exactly what we're dealing with. In some of the upper apartments where there's been extensive water damage, the lab is rotten and the nails securing the lab to the joists have corroded and failed, so it's really important for us to be able to see where those joists are so that we know that we've made a secure and stable connection. Next up is conservation. These are the repairs that we do as funds become available. They're not an emergency, they're done methodically and often with lots of testing and forethought. It's our preferred method, but it's not always possible. And the treatments that we use for plaster are varied and have evolved over time. A treatment that we just started doing a lot in this past year is making sure that all of that lifted and curled finish coat remains on the wall. For this treatment, we start by consolidating the brown coat with a nano line, which you can see Bella doing on the left. And then we photograph the area we're working on so that any pieces that fall off during treatment, we can put them back on. And it's really like cheating with the box when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle. Pieces that are loose but not curled are glued back into place. And for pieces which are curled, we inject a small amount of JR where the finished coat meets the wall. And then we fill the void of the curl using a mixture of lightweight spackle and JR to make it a little bit stickier. In addition to keeping the plaster from falling off the wall, filling that void also prevents it from snapping off in the event should anyone come in contact with it. As mentioned earlier, much of the plaster has become detached from the lab and is in danger of being lost and taking the papered finishes with it. The south wall in apartment 11 exhibited a large area of exposed lab, and the plaster at the western end of the wall was bulging severely. As the plaster was extremely soft and the bulging area filled with debris and broken keys, we were pretty sure that any attempts to try and push that plaster back into place would end up with a pile of plaster on the floor being held by layers of wallpaper. As the wall did not appear to be continuing to move, it was decided to remove as much debris as possible and then to simply fill the void with ether foam so that there's resistance in the event anyone should lean against the wall. For anyone who doesn't know, ether foam is a closed cell polyethylene foam that is acid-free and doesn't off-gas, so it's appropriate for archival purposes. This work is all done very carefully, and the foam plank is cut into narrow platforms that are inserted into the lab, and that serves as a platform for a block of ether foam to sit on top of. And then we'll spackle over the entire opening face, and then we will paint it to match the color of the brown coat. Recently, we've kind of upped our game on these repairs a bit by making them appear more natural. Instead of painting the spackle, we're adding pigment to the mix and mixing it right in. And then we take some of the plaster debris, crush it up, and paint it on. And instead of smoothing the surface, we leave it a little more natural and rustic. And when you walk by these repairs, you can tell that something is off, but it takes a minute to register what it is. We've also been more proactive regarding the conservation of plaster ceilings. Instead of doing repairs as the plaster failed, we're taking a systematic approach to the preservation of the historic fabric. With funding secured from a Partners in Preservation grant, JBC worked with the museum to develop a pilot program for the plaster consolidation. In 2012, we began work on consolidating the ceilings of apartment 3. Conditions in these rooms included stained and peeling paper, failing distemper paints, and cracked and displaced plaster. With assistance from Historic Plaster Conservation out of Ontario, the conservation work is performed from both below and above the ceiling being consolidated. Work begins by installing a system of scaffolding and microjacks to support the ceiling. These microjacks are installed every 12 to 18 inches across the entire surface of the ceiling. We place a small square of silicone paper between the head of the microjack and the ceiling, and this prevents the head of that microjack from sticking to the plaster or the paper when the consolidate comes through, which it always does. At this point, the jacks are tightened just to the point of touching the ceiling. Then the floorboards are removed in the room above, and this is when the real fun begins. The removal of 150 years worth of debris from between the floor. In one kitchen, it entailed me removing 9 inches of wrap PCs and large broken keys are removed by hand and smaller debris using a shop vac. Bits of debris that have become lodged between the sagging plaster and the lap are removed using tweezers and dental picks, and a final vacuum is performed using a HEPA vac. While lying face down in wrap crew for hours on end is not an enjoyable task, it's always exciting to find interesting artifacts. For archaeological purposes, we divide the rooms into 4 quadrants, and anything interesting that we find in each quadrant, we put in a separate bag and then give that to the museum. Found items have included playing cards, bones, buttons, beads, business cards, combs, mirrors, a purse, medicine bottles, and bits of newspapers from the late 1800s. This past summer, we had quite a surprise when we pulled out a bundle of cloth and opened it up to find a gun. This set off an entirely new set of affairs, but the museum now knows the story behind the gun and hopefully will be incorporating it into their interpretation of the space. That is when they get the gun back from the police. Cleaning the floors is a time-consuming task, as floors need to be really clean so that we're not just consolidating dirt and debris. As the weight of the debris is removed from between the joists, the ceiling slowly lifts and the microjacks are tightened several times a day, bringing the plaster back into contact with the lab. Approximately 8 contractor bags of debris and broken keys are removed from above each ceiling, and this is a surprisingly large amount of weight to be removed, and it's a benefit even on those ceilings that have been replaced by wallboard. When doing debris removal, we have to work with the museum to determine where the bags are going to be placed so that we don't cause an issue on the ceiling of a different apartment by adding too much extra weight. The removal of the debris also helps keep the spaces cleaner, especially in those rooms, which are many of them that have missing plaster on the ceilings. Then we start the actual consolidation process. 3 different grades of consolidant are applied wet on wet to the point of saturating the plaster. As you can see in the photo on the right, there are no remaining keys coming through that lap, which is a pretty typical condition in these spaces. But it also makes you think about the stability of all of those ceilings that we have not yet consolidated. The consolidant is allowed to dry for a day, and then we re-key the plaster using a product called Lug-and-Key, which is an adhesive mixture consisting of acrylic resin and fillers. The product is applied to the plaster through the space between the lap with a caulking gun, and care is taken to ensure that the Lug-and-Key at least touches, or in most cases, laps over the sides of the lap to reestablish the keys and hold the plaster in place. To date, we've consolidated 12 ceilings in 6 different apartments. We had planned on doing more when the entire museum was closed for construction, but surprise, surprise, the contractor was running behind, and by the time they gave us access to the full museum, it was the end of the summer and it was going to be reopening in the fall. There just was not going to be enough time to get to all of the ceilings. There were other ceilings which we were going to attempt to consolidate from below, but we did an examination of them and found that the plaster washers that were installed were much longer than we thought, and they did appear to be installed in lab, and they were very secure. So we decided it would be beneficial to wait until we could do it the right way and get full access from the apartment above. Now, consolidation of the ceiling is not an inexpensive treatment. It requires the closing of 2 apartments from the tours for a period of several weeks while the consolidant cures. But what about walls and ceilings that are in very poor condition? As with any museum, public safety is a critical factor. The ceiling in the kitchen of apartment 7 had been covered with netting, which was designed by Robert Silverman's office and installed by Vertical Access to protect visitors in the event any additional plaster falls from the ceiling. In addition to hiding the plaster, what message does it give to visitors about the stability of the space? And can there be a point of no return where the museum, working with the conservator, can determine that the balance between price and visitor safety tips towards the complete removal of damaged plaster, which is either replaced in kind or the bare lap left exposed? The idea of completely removing the plaster at the museum is not unheard of. Some of the earliest apartments had their plaster stripped to bare lap, which were then replastered as part of the interpretation process. I spoke to David Favallaro, Director of Curatorial Affairs for the museum, and after thinking it over, he realized that there's really no hard and fast answer. The museum's preservation philosophy strives for the retention of historic fabric where possible, and while funding is always a consideration, if they see something as essential, they can fundraise for it. Like many issues with historic preservation, they would have to approach it on a case-by-case basis, and various spaces could be treated very differently. There would be a prioritization for the retention of historic plaster in an unrestored apartment that are part of the tour program versus a space that is simply serves as an exit from the building. It might also be a matter of the amount of historic fabric that is extant. This is the ceiling in apartment 17. The majority of the ceiling has already been lost, and what is left is heavily cracked and stained, and a large portion of what remains is a plasterboard repair. David states that they'd be more inclined to consider completely removing the damaged plaster in apartments where it's in poor condition and poses a safety hazard. But again, the ceiling still retains early water-soluble paints, at least 2 layers of wallpaper, and an early form of plasterboard known as sakka board, which is a felt and gypsum wallboard, which dates to the early 1900s. Removal and replacement was recently done in apartment 18. The plaster on the wall had failed completely with a large expanse of exposed lap. Since the apartment serves as the introduction to the Moore apartment and their Union and Hope tour, they chose to replaster the upper portion of the wall and use it to bridge project images associated with the tour, including the Sanborn map showing where the Moore's apartment would have been located, and images which help tell the story of the Moore family. Now, like any conservation treatment, each method has its unique set of pros and cons, which need to be reviewed and discussed before implementing. Control, or performing conservation treatments on an as-needed basis, has three main pros. The work is performed only as required. Localized treatments, meaning that each individual bill is less expensive, and the apartments are closed usually only for 1 or 2 days. The cons include that the repairs are unscheduled. We can't always guarantee that we have someone in the office that can rush down to make an inspection or complete the repairs. It also puts the visitor at a greater risk from falling plaster. The pros of performing the conservation treatments are that it is a proactive approach. You are not waiting and reacting. It retains the historic fabric, and while the paper may be stained, it's still there to be viewed and enjoyed. It also increases public safety. The plaster is no longer at risk of failure. The cons include that the spaces are closed to visitors. People come from all over the world to visit the museum, and with 2 of the 12 apartments closed, it really reduces the visitor's experience. Also, between the scaffolding and the conservation treatments, it can be an expensive process. And one of the main cons is that the consolidation of plaster is a controversial topic. The process essentially turns the plaster into a monolithic unit. It is irreversible and alters the appearance of the plaster by making it dark, shiny, and stains the paper. And is it retreatable? We're not really sure. While the plaster cannot be reconsolidated, it's possible that it could be rekeyed if required. The pros of removing the heavily deteriorated plaster include the increase of public safety. If there's no damaged plaster, there's not going to fall. The recreation of rooms in new plaster allows for targeted interpretation, and it also has no costs associated. There's no surprises, such as paying for the consolidation of plaster only to open everything up and find that everything above the wallpaper was satin board, which could have just been screwed back into place, which actually happened on one of the first rooms we worked on. They weren't very happy, but we learned. We now know. The cons are the loss of historic fabric. Once it's gone, it is gone forever, and anything we could have learned about the building's inhabitants has been taken with it. It also changes the visitation experience. The Lower East Side Tenement Museum is one of my favorite museums, and a big part of that is the connection you can feel to the thousands of people that spend a portion of their lives in these rooms. And the plaster and accompanying finishes, both paint and paper, have a hand in creating that feeling. The sense of time expressed in the ruined rooms would be lost if they were all clad in sheetrock. So as you can see, there's no really firm answers for the conservation of these materials. With layer after layer of historic paper over often an unstable substrate, decisions on means and methods must take into account multiple factors, including public safety, financial constraints, visitor experience, and different or evolving ideas about historic preservation and conservation. But the goal always remains retaining as much historic fabric as possible to ensure that the unique authenticity experienced at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum is retained. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yeah, I was going to open for questions, but go right ahead. Perfect.
great.
And I just sit here.
That was so fabulous. Thank you. So
Thank you.
great. I have a question and then an observation. At what point in the history of tenement design did they introduce the mid-lot light wells that brought direct ventilation of some sort and some direct light into the inner bedrooms?
That was the 1901.
And that was another reform
Yes.
measure?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, my observation, and you'll know this, but I found this really interesting. In the mid-90s, I interviewed a man by the name of Madigo, who was doing an award-winning restoration of a townhouse in Charleston, South Carolina. This building was built in the 1770s, so 250 years ago. And this fellow was just obsessed with restoring this to the condition of that building at the time that it was built. And in his main entrance hall, the grand staircase, he discovered that it had been wallpaper, and that he was able to get back to the original wallpaper. And what I didn't know is wallpaper gets its name from really being paper like you find in a book, which I think was like a folio size 6 inches by 8 inches. So the entire wall was just a seaming together of these little individual pieces of paper. He found the company that made the original wallpaper. They were still in existence, and he was able to get them to change their manufacturing process so they could produce paper as closely to the paper that had gone up in 1770.
That is a Congress request.
I always assumed, I only knew about modern wallpaper with the coming out of the press. Thanks.
During the entire presentation, it's just wonderful. I never once heard a mention of the A word or plaster or the L word or any paint or coatings. How much environmental testing or analysis was done? There's no hot materials in this building that.
So they did do, as part of that 2019 study, they did do materials testing. Lead paint is everywhere. I mean, you can't get around it. No one lives in this space, and the docents are only there for a short amount of time. So, I mean, I've spent hours and hours and hours in this building, and I've done multiple paint reveals on lead paint, and we do testing, and none of us have ever come back with a high lead amount. Because it closed in 1935, there wasn't a lot of stuff that, I don't know that there was any asbestos found in there at all, which is kind of lucky for us. But yeah, there's definitely lead paint everywhere, but the museum has air purifiers in every room, and they make sure that the docents are only in there for a short amount of time, so that they're not really that concerned.
But as far as doing bulk testing of areas and repairs and making sure there's no chrysolite or anything, you continue to do environmental testing, because again, if you're going at having somebody, do a pin, I mean, you're still technically disturbing, or if you have something false. So I guess the question is, how much environmental testing do you do before you?
So they do it, they are actually, because they were concerned about some of the docents, they do have people come in who are monitoring the air. So it is something that they do on a fairly regular basis. Yes?
I think you mentioned at the beginning that when the building was new, it was actually inhabited by relatively middle-class people. Has there been any interest in actually restoring one of the apartments back to that period, which of course would mean taking out the interior windows and really bringing it back to look as it did when the first tenant moved in, which is something I don't think exists anywhere.
So they have done that. They have all of the different, I mean, they've done so much research on this that it's just amazing. And they actually are really good about it. They find something, they do go back and update the spaces. Because one of the rooms was wallpaper, and it was a time when no one that lived here would have been able to afford wallpaper, and it was expensive wallpaper because Andre had designed it. It was based on other wallpaper that they found in the room. But Mary Jablonski said, hey, this never would have been here, and other wallpaper conservators backed her up, and so they took out the wallpaper, and now it's just paint. But yes, they do have 1 or 2 apartments that they have moved the walls back to where they were originally and have removed any of the partitions that were in the wall, so it's just a flat wall. So each of the different apartments that's in there is interpreted to a different time period and a different family that actually lived in the building. So they have made sure that it is true that they're, you walk in here and it's dark because there's no windows that look out into the front of the building. Yeah.
Another question. This may seem a little crass as a question, but you'll understand the spirit of it. So let's just say a high-minded developer had gotten a hold of this building and decided, rather than to treat it as a museum, he had gone in and decided to renovate, but with doing all new plaster work and all new flooring and doing a lot of the things, that you would want to make it habitable. What I'm getting at is, I'm trying to understand how the expense of that work would have compared to the expense of this ongoing work. Are they comparable, or is part of what motivates this type of effort the idea that it can be done less expensively and over a long period of time, so not incur that, one-time cost?
So we, because we are Snoopy, we do all look at the other websites, and so we have found other tenements, and we looked at what their rental rates are and what they look like, because it's just something you do when you're at lunch at the tenement museum. And they have tons of them that have been renovated just like that, and they're like $3,000 for a 450 square foot apartment. No one at that price is gonna put in plaster, it's all sheetrock. They have flooring, but it's flooring. The museum is special in that they don't want new stuff in there. One of the rooms early on was drywall, but they've stopped doing that now because they know it's not real. And so at the Moore apartment, they did take down all of the plaster work and just completely replastered the entire space because that's more authentic to what it would have actually been at the time. Yeah.
With all the water infiltration, were there any mold issues?
It's hard to say. I know that we have opened some things up, but again, that was part of the environmental testing that they did in 2019. The building, until this year, never had any kind of air conditioning or, control that was in there. So, in the summer, it got really hot and humid. So I'm sure there is mold somewhere, but then in the wintertime, it was incredibly cold and dry. So it's just the normal cycle that goes on. We've opened up things and I haven't really been, oh my gosh, there's so much mold in here. Plus, everything in here is lime plaster, which is really good at keeping out.
So, kind of follow up on that. One of the reasons that I asked is that the Crab Barton apartment in Washington, which was, there was a thought of treating it in this way. And we did all the testing and everything to treat it in this way. And we found that the mold actually used this, the ground wood pulp paper as food.
Yes, that
So
was one of the things.
It ate it. And so you couldn't clean the mold off the paper. And it happened to be very toxic mold. So we had to do a big remediation project.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think these guys probably looked out a little bit. This is, ceilings on the 5th floor are just, they're completely gone. It was just years and years of water entering the building.
I have a question about the air conditioning, the HVAC systems, and all the retrofitting for anybody who works doing this kind of interior work. The HVAC is a huge impact on structure, potentially followed or in parallel with the structural. And I was thinking from speaking with you that the HVAC was going to be the one that could have most impact. But then I saw one slide here where you had the structural as work proposed for the wall. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on the technical aspects and the impact on the fabric.
They did an incredibly good job of increasing the structural stability of the space without having to tear out all of the walls. They made very small cuts in some spaces, but they did sister almost, all of the spaces that were bad. They kind of took apart the stairs because we were really concerned that they were going to have to take out all of the plaster and the wood that was next to it. But no, they did it. It's engineering. We're not engineers, so I'm I don't know all of those terms and stuff, but they did an amazing job of making everything secure while damaging the least amount of historic fabric as possible.
And then a follow-up to this question is the fact that the capital project of 2019, right, which brought in the HVAC inclusion, that is a shift in the curatorial approach for the museum. Because I remember being there pre-pandemic in a summer day, and I was thinking, how could these people possibly sleep here? And this must have been so horrible during winter time. But then I said, oh, I'm glad because it's part of the experience, and it's an added factor. You feel the interpretation of the space with your whole body. So I'm curious as to what triggered this shift in mindset, and what do you think it will really mean for the museum experience?
I think we're gonna find out. I have worked here in the winter where we've surveyed with our coats on, and I work here in the summer where, within half an hour, I'm just completely drenched in sweat. We've done surveys in the summer, and people, by the time they got to the 4th floor, were passing out and throwing up. So it was a big safety concern being there in the summer, because not every person that's coming up the stairs is youthful and full of vigor. And they're like, oh, I can walk 4 flights of stairs, but by the time they got to the top, they were not doing so well. And there's no elevator, so it's just, if you walk up, you gotta walk down too. And for years and years, no HVAC was installed because they were very concerned about, this has been 150 years of just being kind of, they opened the windows in the summer and they closed the windows in the winter, and it just expanded and contracted and did what it did. There was a giant concern that once they put HVAC system in here and now had air conditioning, that is the plaster going to fall off the walls, is the paint going to fall off the walls, what's going to happen? So that was why they kind of didn't do it for a really long time. And so we were surprised that they made the decision to put in the air conditioning in there, and we're gonna see, I guess, over the next couple of years what happens. I think luckily because we've been in there, kind of gluing everything back onto the wall, so it hopefully won't be as bad as it could have been. But yeah, it's definitely going to change the experience. And you and I were talking about this the other day. People love the idea of authenticity until it becomes uncomfortable. And then, it would be really great on the physical air conditioning. So yeah, it's a matter of checking that out.
You mentioned it was a passive system. How robust a system is it? Is it going to be cool in the summer, or are they going to keep the temperatures?
It's just going to keep the temperature comfortable. It's not going to be 68 degrees in there in August. They closed off the top of the air shaft, and so that's where all of the ductwork is in the air shaft, so you don't see it at all. And then any ventilation is between the walls. So the goal was to have them just in the transom so that no one would really see it, but then they realized something this big isn't big enough. So then they were trying to put it all in the closet so that it wouldn't be as obvious, but because walls have moved over time in certain rooms, the closets were not always back to back. So it might be in a closet in one room, and like in the Moore apartment, one of the walls has been moved, so it's kind of right outside of the closet in another room. But that's just how they're getting, there's no ductwork visible at all. It's just when they put them in, they were bright white vents from Home Depot, and they were like, oh my God, this looks so terrible. But they're trying to hide them. They're not as pretty as I would like, but if it makes it a little more comfortable.
You've been getting low attendance rates in the summer because people couldn't stand the heat.
So this is something my husband and I were actually talking about the other day, is it's kind of the opposite of what we do now, where the higher floor, your rent goes up. We were wondering, there was definitely different rates, because the higher you had climbed, the rates were usually cheaper, because who wants to move all their stuff up to the 5th floor? And the ones on the 1st floor stay at the high end, because you have the outhouse in the back, and you have horses and stuff, and on the streets in the front. So we were wondering, is it those middle third floors, is that like the prime real estate in these tenements, and would they have been expensive? I mean, it would definitely be interesting to kind of go back and see what the rents, what the differences were between the floors.
Other than the roof, was there anything done to the building envelope to, you know, stabilize, keep water out?
Yes, it was completely repointed. They replaced a lot of the lintels had been, you know, at some point it was modernized, and so all the fronts were chopped off and kind of just, you know, stuccoed over, and so they replaced the lintels. I mean, the stuff that was done, they didn't put any crazy waterproofing between the walls. It was just repointing to match the historic mortar and replacing lost elements. Yeah.
Kind of on that subject, have there been any, has there been discussion of landmark districts of tenements, preserving the urban fabric and making people restore the facades to what they may have looked like?
That's what's really surprising about the Lower East Side is that it's not a historic district. It's just this building. And I think it would be fascinating. I think it would be great. It's just a matter of, can you get the building owners to join in? And they're usually the most vocal opponents because they think it's going to handcuff them, that they can't do anything ever. So, but it would be great to see that.
Who were the mechanical engineers for the project?
I don't know off the top of my head because we weren't involved with that, but I can get that. Kevin, I saw your hand was up at one point.
I was gonna only comment, this image indicates a little bit further discussion about climate control, which is a curatorial decision to protect all the objects. You know, if there's dramatic swings in temperature and humidity throughout the year, and those objects are on display, might be better to have a better control space. I was wondering actually what led to the question, sorry, because we can talk about this at any time, but is there, are there any bleed spots where the work that you guys are doing, that we are doing on the walls and ceilings that start to tie into stuff that are part of you know, the collection? Looking at like, there's a stove right there, are we messing with the wall behind the stove, or the way the flues move through it? Where are the edges that you're having mess with the staff with?
So it really depends on the apartment because there have been some spaces where, because we were doing the floors, we had them remove the stove so that we could get access to all of the space around it and under the hearth. But yeah, anytime that we're working in a room, generally all of the furniture and everything has been taken out, and then it just comes back in when we're done.
Is the furniture actually period or is it reproduction?
It is all period. The Tenement Museum actually has a YouTube channel, and so I think they show them, because it was the same way with 103 Orchard also, it shows them going to flea markets and just trying to find period furniture that would have been appropriate for these apartments. And then some of the stuff is actual stuff that was donated by the families. I mean, not a lot of it, most of it is stuff that they found at flea markets and stuff, but there are some items that would have been in the building at the time.
Current curiosity, did the earthquake impact, did the next day they see flames of paint and plaster on the floor, do you know? Did you get a chance to get back there?
Don't know because I was in Buffalo, but I don't think it happened. I think it was small enough.
This JVC.
Yeah, that would have been, yeah, that's pretty bad. I didn't make it today. But yeah, our work here is not done. I mean, Maris and I are going back, you know, next Monday, and, you know, it's become really difficult because the museum is open, and so we're only allowed to work from 7 to 11 and try and get as much done in that small amount of time as we can.
Or be part of the exhibit.
Yeah.
People pass through.
Yes, we are also part of the exhibit. People pass through every time the tenement goes, which is, I know, makes us alive. But we do that on a lot of the projects that we do. We just become part of the exhibit because the work has to get done, and it's a great way to show people that work is being done and the people that are doing the work. And it's just, I mean, if I go to a museum and I see people working, I'm like, oh, what are you doing? I mean, it's just natural to be curious about kind of some of the behind the scenes stuff.
Any other questions?
Just a real quick question. When you got down to the finished plaster, in most cases, did you find the first finish you found, 1863, across the board, was it the same color? Was it the same paint material that the landlord would have put on that?
So, yes. This brown, yellowish brown is everywhere. It's in every apartment. This is probably the last color that was put on. And what's weird is I've gone to other abandoned buildings. There's one next to our office, and I snuck a peek in there, and it's the exact same color. So, you know, the beginning finishes in the 1863, all of the walls were a beautiful dark green, and all of the wood was wood grained. I mean, they were beautiful, beautiful spaces. And that was that. I mean, we've also done finishes investigations at 103, which when it was constructed for as working class housing. But again, decorative finishes were found in the hallways. They're found, all of the woodwork is still wood grain. So, you know, just because it was for poor people, they didn't skimp on the finishes. I mean, people still, some are, they still be proud to live in. And then that slowly ended.
I have one question, which is, you've been a past chair of the architecture specialty group of the AIC. I'm interested in hearing from you the conversation about conservation and sustainability. We are talking about life cycle assessments. There is now a stitch tool that a conservator, Sarah Number, developed to trace the life cycle and the carbon footprint of these products. How do you feel that we are doing? I mean, your conservators, the whole team is usually exposed to extremely toxic materials for long periods of time, dressed in Tyveks and respirators and whatnot. So it sounds like working with healthier, more sustainable materials would be a benefit for all in the environment. But I also feel that the profession is always focusing on, just like in architecture, is about performance. Things need to last longer. We need to build bigger. We need to, it needs to be stronger. And I think that poses a real contradiction if you're really talking seriously about environmental concerns. So where do you think we are at?
It's hard to say. And this has been a really big topic at AIC also. Conservation is something that's just innately wasteful. I mean, we try, we reuse our plastic sheeting, we, kind of clean our plastic gloves, we'll reuse the dust masks until they're pretty gross. We, create our own Q-tips out of bamboo skewers and cotton balls. But you can't reuse cotton balls. You can't, you can only reuse your plastic sheeting so many times until it doesn't offer any protection anymore. Things like the phenori are much better to use than B72 and acetone because it's just seaweed and we cook it in the stove and it's great. I think we're trying. I think people are trying to develop new things, and a lot of those new things are actually things that were 300 years old that they're bringing back because they work just as well. But they might have some drawbacks that we didn't necessarily expect. I think any aspect of historic preservation is already green. The building's already built, it's the greenest one. So, I think innately we're better than some other fields, but I don't think, we can't consolidate this stuff. We try to use a nano line, which is nice and easy, but it only works on stuff it doesn't work on something that's crumbling. It's not strong enough. So we have to use the consolidant, which is like hardcore and it stinks and we have to blow everything out the window and we can only be in the room for a certain amount of time. I loved methyl chloride strippers. They were the best. They worked on everything. But I also know that, I'll probably die of lung cancer when I'm 65 because I just breathe it in all the time. So,
Your insurance paid up?
Thanks, Mary. So yeah, I think that's a really hard question to answer in a nice, perfect way.
Well, thank you so much.